Hello and welcome back to Principles of Accounting 2. I'm your host, Dr. B, and today we're going to be talking about job order costing. As a quick note and a reminder of where we are in this 8-week course, we are currently in week 2. We just got done discussing managerial accounting concepts. We talked about various types of costs, direct material, direct labor, factory overhead, making up product costs. We talked about period costs, where we allocate sales and administrative expenses to the accounting period through expensing. We also talked about prime cost and conversion cost in the manufacturing process. And we talked about the physical flow of inventory from raw materials to work in process to finished goods. Now that we have a really decent understanding of those concepts, let's explore a new concept called job order costing, which is chapter 19. As a reminder, we're in week 2 of an 8-week course. This week, by Sunday night, you have to complete a chapter 18 quiz and a chapter 19 homework assignment. And as a short reminder, you have the opportunity to receive 2 attempts for all quizzes and homework assignments in this course. And the higher of the 2 attempts will be taken into the gradebook for each quiz and for each homework assignment. And each one has about 5 questions roughly. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into job order costing. As we explore the concept of job order costing, I want you to think about it from both the manufacturer's perspective and from the customer's perspective. A job order is a customer order. Each customer's order is a job for the manufacturer. Customer's order comes in. I start the process of making the guitars for the customers or to fill the customer's order. That process is called a job. It's a job order. That's what we're going to talk about. So I'll explain the process, and I'll explain how the job order cost sheets work. And I'll also compare this to what we call process costing. There are 2 types of costing, really. There are job order cost sheets and process order cost sheets. There are 2 different types of manufacturers. There are what we call job manufacturers and process manufacturers. A job manufacturer is solely focused on fulfilling customer job orders. That's all they do. They fulfill customer job orders. That's job order manufacturing. Process order manufacturing or process manufacturing is simply continuous manufacturing. There are 2 different types of manufacturers: job order manufacturers and process manufacturers. A job order manufacturer, again, the goal here is to fulfill the customer's order, to fulfill the job, by manufacturing the quantity ordered based off of the specifications, and we process it. Process manufacturing or process costing, which we'll explore next week, is focused on continuous manufacturing. Process costing and process manufacturing is continuous. An example of that would be Coca-Cola. They continuously manufacture Coca-Cola bottles and fill those bottles with the Coca-Cola product continuously, regardless of whether it's being purchased or not, regardless of whether it's being ordered or not. They keep making it because they know that they'll keep selling it. Another example would be a milk manufacturer, milk processor. the dairy farmer milks the cows, pasteurizes the milk, then a manufacturing process fills the milk with, fills the gallons with the milk, and then sells it to the grocery store. That's a continuous process. They don't stop doing that. They do it regardless of customer orders. That's what we call process costing. It's continuous, does not stop, and it's regardless of orders. That's process costing. We'll talk about that next week. But right now, we're talking about job costing. Job costing is where I'm fulfilling a customer's job order, okay, by allocating the correct amount of raw materials to the work in process and ultimately manufacturing the product to become a finished good to fulfill the customer's order. So there's a specific amount of quantity that we use, and we trace all of these costs to each job, to each order. I trace the direct labor, I trace the direct materials, I trace the manufacturing overhead to each job, okay, based off of the number of products that are being produced. So in job order production, it's based off of the customer order. It's specific to each order, the products and services. It's usually the production volume's a little bit lower. There's more flexibility and there's low standardization. That's job order. Okay, it's very specific. It's very specific. Customer order comes in, I fill that order. Process manufacturing again it's continuous, it's repetitive, it's the same product, it's over and over, high volumes. That would be things like bottled water, Coca-Cola, milk, food processors like Tyson, Purdue. They all continuously process the food to then sell it to the grocery stores, right? That's continuous. That does not end. That's process. We're going to talk about that next week. But today we're focused on job order. Here's an example. I could use my previous example if you like, but I also like the idea of an auto manufacturer. But I could use the example of my guitar company. My guitar company, I make guitars and for customers. Okay? I don't start making the guitar until I receive an order from the customer. The customer can either be an individual or it could be a company, right? I might sell my guitars to Guitar World, which is a very large outfit. They sell guitars around the world. They have a lot of different stores in each state and each country. Or I might sell my guitars to House of Guitars, or I might sell it to Music Store USA. I don't know. I'm just making things up. I could sell my guitars to them, Music Store USA, or I could sell to you directly to the customer. But I'm not going to start making it until you send me an order or I receive an order from Music Store USA. Music Store USA sends me an order, a customer order. We call that a job order. And when I receive that order, it'll say how many units they want. What type of guitars am I making for them? What type of wood? Is it oak wood? Is it cherry? Is it whatever? A lot of different types of wood. What kind of string do they want? What color facets? They want gold or silver. Okay. And based off the customer order, I get my direct materials. My direct materials, I purchase them from my distributor or directly from the other manufacturer who makes the raw materials. I buy the raw materials based off of the customer's order. When I receive the raw materials, I put them into the manufacturing process, into work in process. And in work in process, I cut the wood based off of the type of wood, for how many pieces for the customer wants. I move it over to the next department. They glue the body to the neck, and they put all the strings and the facets on. And it's all based off of the quantity of each type of guitar the customer ordered. Okay? And then it comes out of work in process, becomes finished goods. And then I deliver it to the customer when it's sold. It becomes cost of goods sold. So in that process, I got my direct materials, my direct labor, and my factory overhead. And all of that together makes up the total cost of the finished good, right? We learned about that in the previous chapter. So that's my example of job order costing. In this example here, it's based off of cars, right? And each job is an individual customer order. That's why I call it job order costing. Each job is an individual customer order. And each job cost sheet will include the direct materials, the direct labor, and the factory overhead for that specific job. Okay? And don't worry, I'll break it down for you, but just kind of filling you in. Okay, so here's how it works. I got my raw materials. So that's direct materials and sometimes indirect materials, right? Like glue, other small parts to manufacture the guitar. So I got my direct materials and indirect materials. Work in process, I have the hourly wages for each employee and the amount of time it takes to complete each job. So for example, when I'm making the guitars, I had mentioned I have two different departments for work in process. I have the cutting department and the assembly department. If I got Joe works in the cutting department, and Joe's responsibility is to cut the wood to shape the body and the neck of the guitar. That's all Joe does. I need to time how long it takes Joe to make each unit to fill that customer's order. Why do I do that? Because I need to know how much I need to bill that customer based off of the actual hours worked. So, and then I add that to Frank. Frank is responsible for gluing together the body of the guitar to the neck of the guitar, and then putting the string on and the facets. Okay. I need to track how many hours it takes Frank to do that for each guitar for that customer order. I multiply the hourly rate that each one gets paid times the actual hours worked for that job, and I bill that to the customer. That's part of work in process. We'll talk about that. And that goes on the job order cost sheet. Then finished goods are the completed units. Cost of goods sold is what it becomes when we sell it to the customer to the product to the customer, sorry. And these are done but with the job order cost sheets. So here's the example of a job order cost sheet. I got the customer's name, their address, the job description, date promised, date started, date completed, where it's going, and the job order number. Job order number is very important because we get a lot of different jobs. So here's how it looks. I have direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. For the direct materials, are the individual raw materials that we use to create the product. In my earlier example, I would have like cherry wood, string, facets. Those are my direct materials. And each Direct material has its own cost based off of the amount of materials I'm using. So that would equal that, and then I would add all up all those direct materials to get a total direct material. Then I would have direct labor. These are the individual employees punching in and out for each job. This tracks the it's the number of hours worked for each employee times their hourly wage to get the total cost for each employee for each day working on that job. I would add up all the direct labor hours. So hourly wage times hours worked on that job, on that specific job, for that specific custom. I would add all that up. Whether it's multiple employees or multiple days or both, add up all the direct labor hours to get total direct labor hours. And then I apply, at the end of the job, factory overhead. The factory overhead, how do we apply factory overhead? There's a couple different ways. I could apply factory overhead based on a percentage of direct labor. I can apply factory overhead based on the total budgeted labor hours. I could do it based off of the total budget for factory overhead divided by labor hours. That's called a direct rate. Or I could do what we call activity-based costing to apply the overhead. Or I can do another method. There's a couple different ways to apply factory overhead. The company typically selects one of three methods. In this example, it's a percentage of direct labor cost, 160%. Okay, cool. So in this case, it's given to us.
Professor, I have a question.
Yes, Marina.
So would this be only on one item, or is this only for various items? Because I'm looking at the job description and it says level 1 alarm system. So are they just working on one car for one alarm system?
Yep.
Or is this like a whole bunch at once?
One alarm system for one car.
Okay.
Because it's a job order. The job order should specify the amount, the quantity, and for what type of product. In this case, just one. Or it could be, in my example with the guitars, I could have a customer order for multiple guitars or just one guitar. One customer might order a bunch of different guitars or a large quantity of one guitar, or they might just order one guitar. But regardless of the quantity being ordered, the job order cost sheet is the same. Total direct materials, total direct labor, total factory overhead for that specific customer order.
Okay, so the rule of thumb is that there should always be one job cost sheet for each item.
Not for each item, for each customer order.
Oh, it's for the customer. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So when you see job order cost sheet, think individual customer. And that customer might order different products. But regardless of what the customer orders, each customer receives their own job order cost sheet. Yeah, excellent question. And so to find the total of the job order cost sheet, we take the total direct materials plus the total actual hours for the job plus an estimate of the factory overhead to equal the total job order cost sheet. The reason why we estimate factory overhead is because we don't know what the total factory overhead is going to be for the year. We only know what our budgeted is for the factory overhead. We'll talk a lot about factory overhead when we get into how to allocate factory overhead. So when I am totaling up job orders, I use a lot of different receipts. Okay. I receive ledger cards for different types of materials being used. I have, for example, in my example of the guitars, I have a materials ledger for wood, for string, and for metal facets. In this example, I have wood, string, metal facets, and I receive those raw materials from my vendors. So I take the receiving reports from my vendors when I order the raw materials, put it into my materials ledger reports or cards. When I use the raw materials in the job, I fill out what we call a requisition form. A requisition form is used to track the delivery of the raw materials to the work in process. It's very important that we track the movement of our inventory from raw materials to work in process through what we call requisition forms. And those requisition forms in the direct materials get allocated to each job cost sheet based off of the amount that's being used for each job. So the requisition follows it to the job. That's how we trace the direct materials. And we also trace indirect materials through requisition forms, but that gets allocated to the factory overhead. Because factory overhead is indirect materials, indirect labor, indirect, that type of stuff. And of course, then we also track electricity, space, all that's through factory overhead. This just kind of shows us how we trace the materials flow from the time that they're purchased from our vendor through direct raw materials into work in process. And then with it, when it gets into work in process, we allocate it to the job order cost sheets. And then when it's finished, it goes to finished goods. So here's an example of a materials ledger card. This shows us when we received it, how many units we received, each unit price, the total, when they're issued, what the balances are. It shows the inflow and outflow of raw materials into our storage room. That's what this shows us. We call it the materials ledger. It's very similar to the other types of ledgers that we talked about in Principles of Accounting 1. When there's a requisition, it means that the people that are going to be fulfilling a job are requesting raw materials from the raw materials department. We complete what's called a requisition form. It's the job, we include the job order number, any type of stock information, the materials we need, the date, how many we need, and who's requesting it. This is an example of that. Materials requisition form. And again, it's used for internal purposes to track the movement of the raw materials into work in process to fulfill the job. And we can sum all of the direct materials used for each job to understand what our balances are for inventory. So as we take raw materials out of raw materials and put it into work in process, we need to allocate that movement through the materials requisition forms. How do we do that? We debit raw work in process inventory to increase work in process inventory by the requisition amount, and we credit raw materials inventory to reduce the total of raw materials inventory. And that what that does, it shows the movement into work in process and out of raw materials.
Professor, say that one more time for me, please.
Sure, Lynette, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yep, you got it. So what I'm doing here is I'm requisitioning raw materials from my storage unit where all my raw materials are, because I need to start fulfilling our customer jobs. I total up all my direct materials that I need in order to fulfill all of my customer job orders. In order to do that, I fill out my requisition form, I send it over to my raw materials department, whatever, storage area, whatever you want to call it. But I need to track the movement of that raw materials into work in process. So in order for me to take it out of raw materials and put it into work in process inventory, what I do is I need to debit work in process inventory by the total amount of direct materials I'm using in those jobs. And I credit raw materials inventory to reduce the raw materials inventory balance, because it's no longer there, right? Taking it out of raw materials, putting it into work in process. To do that, I debit work in process inventory to increase work in process inventory, and I credit raw materials inventory to reduce the raw materials.
So work in process is considered an asset.
Yeah, they both are. I'm taking
Okay.
it out of one asset account and putting it into another asset
okay.
account. Mm-hmm.
I got it.
So just think of it like I'm tracking the movement of inventory out of raw materials into work in process. Both assets, absolutely. You got it.
Okay, I understand.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks for your question. Okay. Now let's talk about labor. Now that I've taken my raw materials out of raw materials and into work in process to be used for each customer job, I also need to track the number of labor hours being used for each job in the work in process stage, right? And how do I do that? For direct labor, which are the hourly employees that are manufacturing the products to fulfill the job, the customer job orders, I use time tickets. Time tickets is when you punch in for work, you punch out for break, you punch back into work, then you punch out to go home. That's called a time ticket. Okay, we punch in, punch out, punch in, punch out. That's a time ticket. Those time tickets are used to track the number of hours being worked on each job. That's direct labor. So time ticket, punch in, punch out, punch in, punch out. I take that time ticket to track the amount of work on each job. That's direct labor. Indirect labor, the salaries of supervisors, the people in the office, etc. That's indirect. Indirect is part of factory overhead. Indirect materials, indirect labor, those are parts of factory overhead because I cannot directly trace them to the manufacturing process. Direct labor and direct materials, I can directly trace to the manufacturing of the products, which go on the job order cost sheets. So on the job order cost sheets, I have my total direct materials used, my total direct hours used, and then I apply the factory overhead. Here's an example of a time ticket. Got the name of the employee's number, the job that they're working on, time they punched in, time they punched out for that job, times their hourly rate. Number of hours worked on the job times the hourly rate equals the total labor for that employee for that job. And I add up all my employees that are working on each job to get total direct labor hours. So I have an employee working on job 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19. I add up all those labor hours for all those jobs to get my total direct labor hours. I add my direct labor hours to work in process inventory. Remember, work in process is where I take my direct labor, or my direct materials plus my direct labor. Those both together equal total work in process inventory. I apply direct materials plus direct labor is my total work in process inventory. So 4,200 hours was worked on all of my jobs. I debit work in process inventory $4,200. Debit work in process inventory $4,200 to increase work in process inventory by 4,200. And I credit factory wages payable, which is a liability. Okay? Factory wages payable. Factory wages payable represents the total amount that I need to pay to my employees for working on those jobs. Make sense? Yes? Yes, no, maybe?
Yes, it makes sense.
Okay, great. So remember, work in process, I take my direct materials plus my direct labor. That's work in process. Okay.
Professor, I have a question. How do you actually, is it a mathematical equation that you come up with the exact amount of time? Do the owners actually have someone actually do the job, and then they say, okay, it should take no more than an hour? How do you actually come up with the time that it takes to complete a job?
Sure, great question.
Uh-huh.
So the best way to do that, there's a couple ways. There's really a couple ways that people actually do it in the real world. Sometimes, yeah, they guess. But in most cases, they use the time tickets. So the employee will actually punch a clock, with the time ticket. Or they'll log into a computer to track their hours actually worked on each job. So they'll punch in, they'll punch out, they'll punch in, they'll punch out for each job. Okay? And so they use the actual hours worked times their hourly wage. So hours worked times hourly wage. That's how we find the amount for each job for direct labor. Does that help to answer your question, Lynette?
No, not really, because I could clock in, but what if I'm bull crapping around? I just want to know, like, how do they exactly say? I think this is more geared towards like assembly lines, but just in general, I don't care if it's with retail or the service industry. How long does it take to clean a carpet that's 10 by 10 foot room? How do you actually come up with that time? Or
through time studies. That's the only way you can do it is through time studies. And how do you do that? It's through punching the clock. That's the only way. There's really no other real method. I mean, you can estimate it, but estimates don't really help that much. So yeah, it's through time studies, and that's the only real logical way you could do it.
Okay.
Yeah, good
So per
question.
job, so well, that will be a study because I would just give a person a specific job, clock in, do this job, and as soon as you're finished, clock out.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
Okay,
and that's what gets billed to the customer.
got it.
Yep, good
Okay.
question.
Also piggybacking to what Lynette was trying to figure out how they will actually know. There's also like a time limit on things like this. So like if
That's
the
true.
customer wants to be done in like a week, it has to be done within that week because it's already contracted to be done. So that's also another way that they also make sure that it's actually done and not like, just doing whatever they want to do.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true, Marina. And so what happens is, Lynette, is sometimes you get a customer that'll say, "Hey, I need this done within a week." Okay, so how many employees? How long each employee is going to work? Uh, all that's another way. There's a time limit on the high side. So that's another method. But in most cases, time studies are the most accurate way to track the direct labor.
Okay, I understand. I got it. Moving forward, even for myself, when it's come time for me to open a business,
Mhm.
I literally would time each each job that needs to be performed. That would give me a layout as to how long it should take the employees to
Ex-
complete a job.
Exactly. That's exactly
Yeah.
right. That's the
Okay.
best. That's really the best way because you want to try to be as exact as you possibly can be, so that way you eliminate any kind of waste. It's like you have to know. It's like, okay, on average, it takes X amount of time for each job based on these time studies. And so with that information, Lynette, you can say, hey, you know what? On average, it takes this amount of time. You're taking this amount of time. So what's going on here? So that way you can investigate that. You'll have something to go off of. Great conversation. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I learned something well, I'm learning, but that
I got you. I got you.
okay, thank you.
Awesome. Great. David, did you have a question?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add to Lynette. I know maybe we're beating a dead horse, but um, I think the question was more about efficiency,
Mhm.
and what she's saying is like, what if someone is taking a long time to do something? Wouldn't you also be able to just see how long another company takes? Because a lot of what you're doing is competing, right? So if you're more efficient, if you're doing more with your time and are producing more, then you're more likely to get the customers. Um, if you do a horizontal comparison and say, well, look, my workers can do this job in 5 days while your workers can do it in whatever. And this is the amount that we'll charge, maybe a competitive rate that's similar to what they're charging.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
in terms of that, in terms of efficiency, that would be kind of like a managerial job to look and see where are places where you can be more efficient. If your hourly, completion time is really long and you're saying, well, why is it taking so long? Then you have to jump in and say, maybe they're not doing certain things and come in and say, okay, we need to fix some stuff to make things more efficient.
Yeah. Excellent comment. And uh,
Yeah,
uh,
it was.
I would add to that and say, you can also because if you're interested in saying, hey, my company's more efficient than your company at performing this job, one way that you can get an understanding of that is you can search to find information that gives you industry averages. You find industry averages for pretty much everything, including uh, how long it takes for employees to perform certain jobs. It's like, okay, the industry average says it should only take me 2 hours to perform uh, um, a full brake job on a car at a repair facility. Okay, the industry is saying that that's the average amount of time it takes. So if the industry says that and your company can do it in less time because your people are more efficient or whatever, that's a great way for you to compare your company to others within your industry, right? And so that's another method that you could use to really kind of track that information. Great questions. Yeah, good conversation. Okay, so overhead. Factory overhead, as we had talked about, are indirect costs that we cannot directly trace to the manufacturing process directly. It would be indirect costs, meaning indirect labor, indirect materials, and then other factory overhead like utilities and etc. How do we determine what the overhead rate is? How do we figure out, how do we apply the factory overhead costs to the respective jobs? There are really three different ways, probably four different ways, but 3 or 4 different ways that we can allocate the factory overhead. Some of them are very straightforward and easy. Others are a little bit more complex, but they're more exact. Okay. Here's how it works. We can set a predetermined overhead rate. This is the easiest one, the absolute easiest one. Predetermined overhead rate. It's a percentage of the total base activity applied to the job. The way that we do that is we estimate our total factory overhead costs. So in other words, I would say, for the whole year, I estimate that my factory overhead costs will be $1.5 million. That's my estimate. That's my budget for overhead costs. Okay. I divide that by the estimated activity base. Hear me out. The activity is an activity within manufacturing. An activity could be things like number of assemblies, number of hours expected to be worked, number of hours driven, or number of machine hours. These are all activities within manufacturing. We could estimate what our activity amount will be. So here's an example. Let's say I estimate my total overhead for the year to be $1.5 million. Okay? And I'm going to divide that by 10,000 hours my employees will be working on each job, or a total for the year. 10,000 labor hours total for the year that my employees will be working on those jobs. That gives me a factory overhead rate of $150 per hour. So $1.5 million is my total estimated factory overhead cost for the year, divided by 10,000 labor hours for the year, equals $150 of overhead per hour. So I would apply that to each job. So 150 overhead dollars per hour times the actual hours worked on each job. That would equal my applied factory overhead for each job. That is what we call the predetermined overhead rate method. It's very straightforward, very easy. It's also called the single plant-wide rate method. is another word for it. And it's that rate is applied to each job, regardless of the job itself. So $150 per overhead rate hour times the actual labor hours worked on each job equals the applied overhead for each job. And so that's what will be recorded on the job order cost sheet. And at the end of the accounting period, we would make adjustments if it's over or under that estimate. So for the predetermined overhead rate, again, we take the estimated overhead costs for the year divided by the activity base for the year. In our example, I have $1.5 million, so 1,500,000, so 1.5 million, divided by 10,000 labor hours. So 1.5 million divided by 10,000 hours equals $150 per overhead hour. I will debit work in process inventory by the factory overhead applied and credit factory overhead by the overhead rate applied. In this case, in this example on the slide, it's 160% of direct labor. That's the method that this company used. So we would debit work in process inventory to increase work in process inventory. That's when we're applying the factory overhead and crediting factory overhead expense 67.20. That's one method. So as you know, factory overhead includes things like indirect labor, indirect materials, and other various things. You can just take all of those actual amounts, add those together to get your actual factory overhead. So debit factory overhead and credit raw materials inventory. For the indirect materials used during the month. And for the indirect labor for the month, we would debit factory overhead, credit factory wages payable. And to record other, we debit factory overhead and credit all of the other expenses being used. Thanks, Marina. And this graphic representation shows us the flow from raw materials to work in process to finished goods for cost of goods sold. So the physical flow, the workflow, as they say. Raw materials to factory overhead to work in process to finished goods inventory to ultimately finished cost of goods sold. It's just a physical cost flow. And this is a summary of all of the journal entries that make up that cost flow. And this is a schedule of cost of goods manufactured, direct materials used plus direct labor used plus factory overhead applied equals total manufacturing costs plus beginning balance equals total cost work in process minus the ending balance equals cost of goods manufactured. And we can determine whether it's overapplied or underapplied based off of the estimates and the actual performance. So how do we determine if something's overapplied or underapplied? If it's underapplied, that means we didn't apply enough factory overhead. If it's overapplied, we applied too much factory overhead. And how do we know the difference? We take the estimate and compare it to the actual cost. to adjust if it's underapplied, we debit cost of goods sold to increase cost of goods sold and credit factory overhead. If it's over, it's the opposite. That's for service companies. Yeah, we're almost done. We got like 2 more slides left. For service companies, a service company, of course, is not going to follow the same type of job order costing system, but you could apply similar. For a service company, there's not going to be direct materials, raw materials. There's not going to be raw materials in service companies, but there will be direct labor and factory overhead. And so you can apply the same type of process to a service company like an airline or to a hotel or to an advertising company or some other type of service business. And the difference between the job is instead of it being a physical product, it's a customer that you're working on. And that, my friends, is the end of job order cost system. Any comments, questions, concerns on job order costing? You're all good. Okay. As a quick reminder of what's due this Sunday night, you have the Chapter 18 quiz and a Chapter 19 homework assignment. There are 2 attempts for each quiz and each homework assignment in this course. The higher of the 2 attempts will be taken. So please complete the Chapter 18 quiz and the Chapter 19 homework assignment by this Sunday night. You will have access to this recording once it's posted this afternoon. Please remember, you can always email me, call me, set up office hours if you ever have any questions or if you need to go over anything in more detail. I'm always going to be here for you. So please make sure to reach out. Email me, call me, set up office hours, whatever it takes. I'm here for you 100% of the time. I'm here for your success. In the meanwhile, please make sure to stay safe, wash your hands, do the right things. And if you ever need anything in the meanwhile, just please reach out to me. I'm here for you.
Hey, Professor.
David.
That was chapter 18. No, 19 was just completed, right?
That's correct.
That was 19.
Yep, that was 19. And
okay, and the quiz is for the last chapter we just did before that.
Yep, so the quiz Chapter 18, and then homework is Chapter 19.
All right, and you said I can still finish that discussion from week 1?
You got it, yes.
Thank you. Have a good week.
Awesome, thank you too.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. I did take my 18 quiz already, so.
Great, awesome.
Yeah.
Sounds good, I appreciate that. Well, thank you all so much for your time today. Appreciate all of you. Stay safe, wash your hands, do the right thing. I'll see you again next time.